My name is Nat Freedland, and I have written a book called The Occult Explosion. On this record album, you're going to hear voices of today's most important leaders in the occult and in ESP research. I think you will find that listening to the ideas of these people is going to change and greatly enrich the way in which you look at your world. At its highest levels, the occult is an adventure in mind expansion. Welcome now to the voices of the occult explosion.
Okay, I think a witch has got to be female. I don't believe it's possible for a male personality to occupy himself with this type of activity. And besides being female, a witch has to be psychic. And I think that anyone who says they practice witchcraft and is not highly intuitive and doesn't have extrasensory perception is lying to themselves. Because you have to be able to project your emotions and influence your environment along the same bridge that you would ordinarily be receiving impressions from.
What was the history of witchcraft? Where did it come from?
Well, I think witchcraft has existed ever since the beginning of man. Anytime a mankind attempts to alter his destiny in some way with various methods that may have nothing at all to do with anything obvious, whenever you take an inanimate object and you say, this is going to bring me love, or this is going to bring me courage, or happiness, or wealth, that's witchcraft. And I think man has always needed to do this, and witchcraft has always existed.
What about the religious aspects of witchcraft, or organized covens?
Well, there are organized covens today that I don't really value too much. I think a lot of them are people looking for some kick, wanting to find another way of existing. They may be sincere, but I don't think they have anything to do with religion. Most of them that I've had contact with are not terribly informed about the religious origin of the witchcraft they say they're practicing. And the Druid religion, has gone out of existence quite some time ago.
Where did you get your knowledge of witchcraft?
Well, I come from a group of witches who believe that it's a very personalized action. My grandmother's a witch, and my grandmother's great-grandmother was a witch. I'm 6 generations of witches. And I learned from my grandmother when I was a very young child how to do all sorts of little things that she thought were very potent and important, how to make packets and amulets and cast spells and perform rituals, and use all sorts of methods to read into the future. And she was convinced that the objects were the things that had the magic in them, and I'm convinced that she had the magic in her energy and her emotion and her subconscious. And that's where the thing took place.
Give us sort of an example of a ritual or spell that would be used for a specific end, and how would this work?
Well, there are all sorts of things that you can do. I'm convinced that if you create your own spell, it has a greater effect on your life. But very many people don't have the confidence to do this as beginners. So I think a simple spell is to light the flame of a candle and to sprinkle a circle of salt around the area that holds the candle and you, and then write down on a piece of paper what it is you want to accomplish in a very simple statement, maybe a sentence or two, and then burn this in the flame of the candle, all the while concentrating very dynamically upon the effect of the flame. And when you have burned this to an ash, then you know that what you want is about to come your way. The main purpose in the practice of witchcraft is to generate within yourself a high level of energy that will then carry you successfully through all situations. So the main point is to psych yourself up and reach some kind of an emotional, physical, intellectual high. And this is done through a very rigid, disciplined method of performing a ritual. The people who say they are witches, and there are very many thousands of them in the United States, may or may not be witches. That I don't know. I haven't gone through any special sort of a research or survey on this. But there are very many thousands more who don't say they're witches, who do practice. There are men who are in very high office, who utilize the abilities of witches, and who are convinced that these things work. And scattered throughout the world, I couldn't say them, probably are millions. Witchcraft only works so long as the witch is capable of sustaining the energy needed, and I think the witch is at times able to falter. You have to be obsessed with what you're doing. You have to become completely involved in it and almost psychopathic about getting the thing you want. And if you're not able to sustain that high pitch of psychoses and obsession, you don't do it. You can't cast a spell. So it works so long as you work at it. And it doesn't work when you become a little bit normal.
What do you feel then is the value of witchcraft as opposed to just being a psychic?
I think psychics are a very passive lot. And a witch utilizes that same ability to sense and know and feel. But she sends out information rather than merely receives it. And she's able to activate conditions and stimulate the environment into certain directions. I am psychic, but I use it in another way. I don't just receive thoughts. It's too passive a role for me.
Do you think that most people have the ability to become a witch?
No, I don't. I don't think most people can become witches any more than most people can write or dance or sing or paint. I think you're born with the ability. You don't have to be born into a family of witches, but you definitely have to be born with the emotional capacity. And in the same way that everyone can't possibly project the emotion of love on a movie screen, everyone can't perform witchcraft either.
I'm convinced, after 13 years of study and investigation, that the Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial vehicles whose origin, in other words, is off the Earth. So-called flying saucers, in other words, are real. Now, the terms flying saucers and UFOs have been used to mean a great many things. What I mean are the reports of things having definite size, shape, and texture, and behavior that's very peculiar, that is unlike things that we know how to make. And reports like this, that cannot be identified as known phenomena by competent investigators. This is perhaps 10 to 20% of the total number of reports that have been examined by investigators. Now, the phenomena is worldwide. It's been going on heavily for 25 years, and sort of lightly for 2,500 years, as far as we can tell. Every country in the world, all kinds of people. There are many multiple witness cases. There are a number of cases involving separate witnesses, that is, people who don't know somebody else is watching the same peculiar thing, and who independently report what they observe. There are many cases involving radar, cases involving not only radar on the ground, but radar in the air, and a visual observer on the ground, and a visual observer in the air. There are many cases in which we are dealing with reports of things fewer than 500 feet away from the observer. In some of these cases, the object has been observed on the ground, and observed landing and taking off as well, and in some cases accompanied by humanoid-looking creatures. That is, people, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and a body. Maybe people is the wrong word, but creatures nevertheless. Now, the total picture here, in other words, is an impressive amount of data available from the Air Force, from the private organizations, and there are a number of quite respectable ones, from the professionals. There are many scientists who have spent many years of effort digging into UFO sightings, and who find that there is an inexplicable residue, 10 to 20%, which point very clearly toward intelligently controlled extraterrestrial vehicles. So I'm convinced, in other words, not because I want to believe that we are being visited, not because I wish we were being visited to help us solve our problems, but because the evidence, the data, the reports, the total collection of information that is available to the interested observer is overwhelming. One of the major things that I bring to this subject is a background in advanced technology. So that to me, coming here from another solar system isn't bothersome. It's feasible with what we know now from programs that I have worked on directly, fusion propulsion systems, for example. The behavior of UFOs in the sky, The sudden changes in the direction, the ability to hover, to move straight up and down, to move silently, without an exhaust, to go forward and then back along the same line, clearly is not behavior that's achievable with present aircraft. That doesn't mean that it violates the laws of physics. It is clear, if one studies the data, that the government has misled the public, and it is also clear that there have been a number of classified cases. I worked under security for 14 years. Let me assure people that the government can keep secrets, if it so chooses. We hear about the ones they can't keep. We don't hear about the ones that they can. So I am absolutely convinced that someplace in the government there's a big collection of UFO data. Whether this means that we've captured one, duplicated it, or whatever, I haven't the faintest idea. I have many reports from people who were in the service of strange events occurring where there was a cordon put up around an area in which something had landed, and which the object, whatever it was carted away. Now, this would be equally true if this were a Russian spacecraft or a Russian missile warhead or whatever, as if it was a UFO. I've heard many such reports, all kinds of rumors about what we have sitting hither, thither, or yon in the way of creatures, craft, and what have you. I've never been able to establish the validity of these. This doesn't prove that it hasn't happened. It seems clear to me that if the government had captured a UFO, the thing to do would be to cart it off to a secret laboratory and try to figure out how it works. You don't tell the public, and you don't tell the Russians. And so, hopefully, after several years of hard work and billions of dollars, you figure out how it works, then you've got the system. And you still don't tell the other guy, because you don't want him to develop a countermeasure. This is standard operating procedure. When the first A-bomb was exploded, in the newspapers the next day, there was an article that an ammunition dump had blown up. Unfortunately, nobody had been hurt. We didn't say an atom bomb was blown up. One of the many myths about UFOs is that there haven't been any good sightings, that all sightings have been by typically a drunken bum at 3 o'clock in the morning, that sort of thing. One of the cases that has really excited me is a very recent one that occurred in Delphos, Kansas, a small town of just over 600 people, on November 2nd, 1971. Ronnie Johnson was taking care of the sheep, 7 o'clock at night, cold, wet. Was heading back toward the house to eat dinner when he spotted this glowing object, could feel vibration from it. It was sitting just 7,500 feet away from him, just beyond the corner of one of the sheds on the farm. Suddenly, the glow got much brighter, made a roaring sound. It took off, not straight up because there were trees in the way, but across the shed. He yelled for his parents, who came out and saw this thing leaving in the sky. Didn't believe him that it had been sitting on their soil. Until they went back to where the object had been, they found several limbs of trees that had been knocked down, and they also found a glowing ring, about 8 feet in diameter, about a foot across. A ring of soil glowing and some glowing spots on the trees. Ronnie's mother touched the soil. Her fingers went numb. She rubbed the soil off her fingers onto her leg. It became numb at the spot where she touched it. She couldn't take pulses at the resting home where she worked for 2 weeks. The soil remained dry for months. Didn't support germination of plants. Wouldn't absorb moisture. The rest of the place was a quagmire in the middle of winter, and there was the ring of soil, dry as could be, lighter in color. We're doing tests on that soil to try to establish what happened, why it won't grow, and that sort of thing. This is but one of hundreds of similar kinds of landings that have been observed all over the world. A different kind of case, in the sense that in this case creatures were involved, is the story of Betty and Barney Hill, a couple up in New England, who were taken on board a saucer, physically examined, put back out, told they wouldn't remember what happened, and didn't remember anything other than what happened before they were taken on board the saucer. It was only after regressive hypnosis on the part of a very competent psychiatrist 3 years later that they found out what had happened. They each relived the same experience, this bizarre experience of being taken on board by these humanoids against their will, examined, put back out. They were treated as specimens. I spent 4 hours with Betty and Barney, convinced that they were telling the truth. There are cases like this en masse. They have been described in government publications. Most people have never read the publications. It is not true that UFOs are observed mostly over the United States. It's a worldwide phenomenon. There have been very busy years, flaps, if you will, in France, in South America, in Australia, in Canada, in England, in Africa, in Japan, everywhere. It's also a modern myth that the number of UFO sightings was 0 before, say, 1947, and has been a big number ever since. The modern era began in the middle of the Second World War, with sightings in both over Germany and Japan, and by American and Axis pilots, each thinking it was the other's secret weapon that they were watching. But actually, there are documented sightings that go back thousands of years. They weren't called flying saucers, but they certainly match, in the physical descriptions and in the behavior, what we today refer to as flying saucers. Another area about UFOs that really intrigues me is the philosophical one. The implications for mankind of finding out that he is neither alone in the universe nor the most advanced civilization. I think man's ego has really stood in the way of mankind moving in the right direction, that is, a peaceful world for all the people on it. And I think that perhaps the most important thing about UFOs is that it will force the younger generation to think of themselves as being Earthlings, rather than Americans or Russians or Chinese, black, white, male, female. If the people of this planet start thinking of themselves as Earthlings simply because they recognize that there's somebody coming from someplace else, and so how can you talk about what country you come from if you're dealing with creatures from another solar system? I mean, countries are trivial compared to planets in that case. And I think that's man's biggest hope for his future. It's not that we'll unite against our invaders, so to speak, but rather that we will grow up, that we'll start living up to our potential. Unfortunately, there isn't a government on this planet that would like its people to think of themselves as Earthling first, rather than as members of that government first. But the philosophical implications of this are really rather profound. And I think that it's very important for us to recognize something that a great German physicist once said. Max Planck said that new ideas come to be accepted not because their opponents come to believe in them, but because their opponents die and a new generation grows up that's accustomed to them. And so this is why I speak at college campuses. This is why I've given up trying to reach the ancient academics whose minds are made up and they say, don't bother me with the facts, I know they can't be real. And it's because I think that man's biggest hope for the future lies with the youth and with a new look at where man fits in the universe.
Astrology is as much of a physical science as astronomy is. The sky is a big circle divided into 12 equal parts. Each part is a sign of the zodiac, and you can tell what part of the sky is what sign by knowing the stars that are contained therein. Where you see the crab in the sky is where Cancer is. We know what sign we are by the fact that the sun is traveling through that part of the sky at your time of birth. There are 9 other planets, each of which is in a particular position in the sky. Each planet has mass and weight. Mass and weight gives off energy, whether it be considered radiomagnetic, gravitational, whatever. It does give off energy that travels through the universe and impresses upon us its own particular force. That sets up a pattern from your birth and continues with you through your life. By knowing what each of the planets mean and where they are in your particular chart, you know what your basic structure will be.
What are some of the proofs of the way this works, in human life? Or how can you see this demonstrated?
You can see the reality of astrology demonstrated by, number one, knowing your own chart and watching your evolution along with it. For example, you know that you are a Cancer and that your basic structure is moody, is fairly psychic, emotional. You see in your progress chart that you have evolved into a Leo, and you will feel a definite personality change, a definite change in the way you relate. You will become a lot more outgoing, flashy, in fact. And if you follow your process and progression through your chart, you just know what's going to happen, and you know where you're going to be going. And if you have your chart as well, you can see what your problems are, your negative points and your positive points, and you can see how to evolve through, with, by, and for them.
What do you mean by progress chart? How can one progress from a Cancer to a Leo?
Nothing in the universe stands still. The stars and planets are continuously in motion. And we, from the moment of our birth, don't stand still. We evolve as well. Mathematically, you can see where the planets in your chart are going to be moving. You can see from what house they will be going from and to. You can see how they will change. From that, from the mathematical reality, you can translate it into a metaphysical reality and thereby see not only where you are coming from, but where you are going to. Astrology is almost a totally mathematical science. It breaks down symbols into language through the process of mathematics and astronomy.
Suppose two people were born at exactly the same moment, in exactly the same place. Wouldn't their destinies be identical?
Their destinies will be identical depending upon their environment. One of the queens of France back when asked the same question of her astrologer. They found a commoner that had been born at the same time in the same place, and her life followed exactly the same pattern, the only difference being that one was a queen and one was a commoner. They had children born at the same time, they married at the same time, they had illnesses at the same time.
What are the most important factors in a person's astrological chart?
Everything is important. The sun is your conscious awareness, the moon is your subconscious, Venus is how you relate and feel love, Mars is your physical energy, Mercury is your mind, the way you communicate, Jupiter is your expansiveness and your philosophical spaces, Saturn is your discipline and where the weight comes into your chart, the heaviness, Uranus is your eccentricities, Pluto is your obsessions, and Neptune is your transcendental creative space. Neptune rules music, poetry, motion pictures, and the psychedelic drugs.
What's the meaning of the houses in the chart?
Houses show how you progress through life. Your first house is your personality. That is the first thing you relate to. Second thing a human being relates to is his money and possessions, an extension of himself. The third is to communicate. The fourth is his home, and also the home of his spirit, the soul. The fifth is pleasures, love affairs, and children. The sixth is service to other people, and if service is not completed, physical illness. Seventh is partnership, not only marriage but business partnership and relating to the outside world, the public at large. Eighth is death and regeneration. Ninth is travel, long-distance travel, higher education, and philosophy. 10th is what the world expects you to be, usually your profession. 11th is friends, hopes, and wishes, and 12th is the underworld, the nebulous house of karma, as it were. Each house is ruled by a sign from Aries right through Pisces, and has the same general characteristics as that sign.
What's the connection of astrology to karma?
Astrology shows you how you work out your karma this time round.
Is the astrology column in the daily newspaper of any use? Is that real astrology?
Astrology of the daily newspaper is good for amusement value. It takes into consideration your particular sun sign and where the moon is in the sky at the time. It's fragmentary astrology, and as such cannot be given any value.
What's the most important thing for a person who wants to start knowing about astrology to find out? Does he just have to know the entire system for it to really make
sense? The most
sense?
important thing for a person just getting into astrology is having his own chart done. No one can relate to astrology unless they see how it relates to them as a human being. Until then, it's just a very nebulous, semi-occult, unknown field. Once you have your chart done and see how astrology shows you who, what, why, and when you are what you are, you can begin to understand it. If you want to get into it further, there are a lot of good books that can teach you the system, and it's not all that hard to learn. The mathematics are no more difficult than third grade mathematics. And it's really good to know it yourself because you can follow your own chart. Your natal chart is where you were when you were born. Your progress chart shows where you are now, and through the same simple mathematics, you can go even further into your future and see where you will be. And you also can relate the transiting chart, where the planets are in the sky at this particular instant in time and space, to you. It becomes a multi-level chess game. You know what each of the pieces means, you know how they work, and interrelating the three shows you exactly where you are.
What does the Aquarian age mean in astrology?
Time span is broken up into 12 great ages. Each age is the way that particular generation evolves, the light that is given off. Each age is approximately 2,100 years. The age we're just coming out of is the Piscean age. The light of the Piscean age was Christ, known as the Fisher of Men. Each age starts with the energy being totally pure and used thusly. During its time, it becomes corrupt, reaches a peak, and dies as the new age is born. We are at the point of transition between the two ages. The dregs of the Piscean age, the Christian culture, are just starting to fade. The Aquarian age people are just starting the process. The definition of the Aquarian age would be energy used purely, intellectually, and electrically.
How much of what's in its chart is something that you can overcome, or how much of there is that you can't escape?
The stars impel, they do not compel. You can change anything you want to change.
The development of such supernormal powers as telepathy, clairvoyance, and control of the autonomic nervous system is most interesting and very probably possible. I call this psychotechnology, but when I think of what human beings are doing with ordinary technology, I wonder what disasters they may bring about by extending their powers of control still further. Several governments are already studying their military applications. I think we should distinguish, like the Buddhists, between the way of powers and the way of wisdom. The way of powers reaches out to an almost godlike control of circumstances. But if its ambitions could ever be attained, if what we call the will or ego could be master of the world, our lives would be as tedious as making love to a plastic woman. Is that what we really want? Think it through. Would you genuinely like to be immortal, omniscient, and omnipotent, knowing all and remembering all, without rest or forgetting, forever and ever? The way of wisdom, on the other hand, is concerned not so much with power as with self-discovery. Who am I? And what is really going on? And this way leads to the understanding that my true self is in fact the vast and inconceivable space out of which this universe is produced. My body, your bodies, are points at which it becomes aware of itself, like sparks of flame coming and going on the back of the fireplace. And since variety is the spice of life, it takes a different point of view with each one of us, and then keeps on letting go of itself in what we call death, so that the process is not dulled by monotony and boredom. There is therefore no need for you to rule the world, because you're doing it already. But this you is not what you have learned to think of as you, not your ego or personality. These are no more than extremely incomplete images of yourself. Because then he knows who he is, the wise one is not ambitious for power. But then, how do we get this knowledge? How can we actually feel ourselves, not as poor little me, but as the background of the universe? Well, of course, you, as you think of yourself, can't do it at all, because this you is only an image, an idea, with no more reality than Tuesday or an inch. If this is understood, the rest is silence. There is nothing left to do but be clearly and vividly aware of what is happening, without comment, without putting it into words, without asking questions. This is what we call meditation or contemplation. Simply being aware of truth, reality, or what is, in silence, without talking to yourself. In this state, it will be seen that, in fact, there is neither past nor future, but just eternal now. Any difference between yourself and what you are experiencing vanishes. There is just this happening. Watch your breathing. Are you doing it? Or does it happen to you? Neither. There is just this going. This attitude may sound passive, but out of the conscious passivity of meditation, as out of the unconscious passivity of sleep, there comes, by reflex, enormous energy, the energy of infinite space. Listen. By just letting my breath fall out, not pushing it out, comes this.
Is there really a communication from one mind to another mind? The question's been asked and kicked around for at least a century among scientists, and most, what I'd call hard-nosed scientists, say, of course not. It's obviously absurd. If there were such a thing, we wouldn't be surrounded with such mystery. We would be able to say, I'm thinking of something, what am I thinking of? And be able to reproduce it in a laboratory. I wish it were that simple. It isn't. But with many, many controlled experiments that we've been doing for a good many years, we know that if we want to send a message, whether it's a symbol on a card, or whether it's a very dramatic picture, or whether it is a thought, the message does get through. Sometimes it's very distorted, sometimes it's almost impossible to recognize it, but it comes through. Sometimes, rarely, the telepathic message is so clear and so precise that it is absolutely startling. And I'm not talking about here necessarily in the laboratory. I'm talking about people who come in to see me who say to me, I had a vision or I had a dream, and I saw my son being killed in Vietnam at 3:40 in the afternoon. Very shaken up, very disturbed, because in actual fact, accounting for the difference in time between Vietnam and here, at that very moment that that vision appeared, the son had been killed in the way the vision described. Now, these are spontaneous episodes that occur, and occur so often that Dr. Ryan and his wife in Durham, North Carolina, have about 10,000 such reports on file, and I haven't been working nearly as long as the Ryans have, but I've got a collection of about 1,000 such stories on file. And it's awfully hard to discredit that kind of evidence. It's startling that suddenly, after 80 years of research that was going on in the laboratory, and very dull kinds of research, doing all sorts of trial after trial with card guessing, suddenly, in the last 3 or 4 years, exploration in psychic phenomena has just mushroomed. And I think there are 2 reasons. One is a book that was published not too long ago, 1970, called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, which very definitely indicated that a lot of work in the Soviet Union is devoted to research in parapsychology, in the fields of telepathy and psychokinesis, which is moving objects at a distance with one's own mind. Now, that's a very strange thing for the Russians to be working on, particularly since they are devoted to a dialectical materialism. And what they're researching is anything but material. It's ephemeral. It's of the mind. And this book so well documented what was going on in the Soviet Union that I personally, as a parapsychologist, and several other American parapsychologists, traveled to the Soviet Union to find out if that book was an accurate description of what was going on, and we found out that it was. Well, this suddenly started a new era in parapsychological research because the Russians are using very sophisticated electronic equipment, and they're doing all sorts of things that we just hadn't thought of before. That put us on our mettle, and we started to work to see if we could get the results the Russians have gotten, and that leads to my own particular interest of the past couple of years, which is a special kind of photography. It's a photography that's been around for about 85, 100 years, but was relatively ignored until somebody in the Soviet Union named Kirlian developed an apparatus that could take pictures of human parts of the body, or metal, or leaves, and he found out that there was emanating, using this electrical radiation field photography, emanating from the leaf or the human being, what in old parapsychological terms was called an aura, but which the Russians don't like that kind of word. They call it a bioplasma body. I don't know what to call it. I think Americans like to refer to it as corona discharge because it has a nice, respectable, electrical feeling to it. But whatever it is, this emanation that becomes visible with radiation photography shows that the human body, or any organic material like, for example, the leaves of different kinds of plants or flowers, will change its structure and its emanations and its internal characteristics depending on what we do to it. For example, we have taken leaves and we've slashed them. And after slashing them, when we take a picture in color, where the slash was is just oozing with red stuff that looks very much like blood. Well, we haven't tried slashing human beings. I think that would be a nice thing to do, and if I ever get courage, I'll do it on myself, but I certainly couldn't ask for volunteers. But with human beings, if we give them a drug, for example, their whole emanation changes very dramatically. And we've tried all kinds of drugs. Certain drugs increase the emanation, other drugs decrease it so that it's almost non-existent. In other words, we think we're looking at some characteristic of the body that the ancients, even in biblical times, or certainly in India, the yogis, have frequently described this radiation that is emitted from people, from all living nature, which is part of the body. It penetrates with the physical body and extends a certain degree beyond the body. And in occult literature, they'd call it, I think, the astral body. Some of the most interesting research that's being done right now is using physiological equipment. Everybody knows that there is such a thing as the electroencephalogram, that we generate brain waves and that they can be recorded. Well, what's being carried on those brain waves? Is it some sort of telepathic message? And there are other things that we can look at, too. For example, there is such a thing as vasodilation, which means that the blood vessels in the fingers and around the periphery of the body, when one is excited, get constricted. And when one is relaxed, they become dilated. The blood flows to the surface. Now, that's a very simple physiological phenomenon. We all know about it. But what Douglas Dean, for example, who's an eminent parapsychologist, was able to show was that we can use this vasodilation, this flow of blood in or out of the blood vessels on the periphery of the body, to demonstrate telepathic messages. And what he did was a very simple but interesting experiment. He would have a person lying down with the attachment called a plethysmograph on his finger, and he would simply be reading names from a telephone book. But every once in a while he'd put in a name that was very personal and meaningful to the subject. And for all the names that were read out of the telephone book, there was just perfectly ordinary vasodilation. But when the name that meant something came along, there would be on the plethysmograph sudden constriction of the blood vessels, which showed that there was a response physiologically in that person. Then Douglas Dean went into another room where the person couldn't hear what was going on and would read these names, and the same thing would occur, as if telepathically they were picking up that name even though they couldn't hear it. Very extraordinary. That work is preliminary, but it certainly has been replicated several times and is well worth pursuing. In other words, our bodies tell us a lot if we would just pay attention to what they have to say. The history of ESP is a rather fascinating one because it was started by the best scientists in the field, their respective fields, physicists, biologists, and so on, in England. And what they were very interested in, oddly enough at that time, were the phenomena that come with hypnosis. For example, Sir William Barrett was an eminent physicist who was also a very good hypnotist.
What period of time was
this? Was 1885 through 1900, early on. And it's interesting, incidentally, that most of the work with unconscious mind was going on at that time. It was beginning. Freud was doing his preliminary work, exploring the unconscious mind through dreams. In England, a man, a very eminent scholar by the name of F.W.H. Myers, was exploring what he called the subliminal mind. We now use that word subliminal for advertising, if we get something below the threshold of what we can see, but nevertheless makes an impression. And he went into the unconscious mind, and with hypnosis, men like Sir William Barrett and other very eminent English scientists were also exploring the unconscious mind. And they found out that in a deep state of hypnosis, the hypnotized subject could tell them what they were thinking about. Now, that's a pretty remarkable finding, and they wanted to know if this could be documented in the laboratory to demonstrate that there was and is such a thing as telepathic communication. Now, the interesting thing about the hypnosis is that the hypnotist can't read the subject's mind. It's the hypnotized subject who can read the hypnotist's mind. And one of the most famous experiments that Sir William Barrett did was to take a rather illiterate Irish girl, young girl, get her hypnotized deeply, and this started as an accident. While she was in the hypnotic state, he suddenly got the desire to have a peppermint, and he popped a mint into his mouth. And the girl spluttered and said, "Why for you put a peppermint in my mouth?" Now, it wasn't in her mouth, it was in his mouth, but she tasted it. And he was so startled by this that he went into another room, and then he went into closets, into another house, and did this peppermint tasting experiment, and then used other tastes, and she picked it up every time. Well, it's interesting that that research sort of went underground. Nobody pursued it, or if they did, they didn't get any results. But now, in Czechoslovakia, and interestingly enough, it's in the Czechoslovakian army that they're doing these experiments. I saw a film where a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist hypnotized a subject and then went through a very elaborate controlled experiment where there were 8 different substances to taste. And in a double-blind experiment, one was picked randomly, and he tasted a lemon, and the hypnotized subject reported lemon. And then he tasted another substance, pepper, and the hypnotized subject tasted pepper. So that this is still going, 100 years later, this kind of experimentation is still going on, but we haven't yet made it so commonplace that anybody in their laboratories can reproduce it. And until we can do that, most scientists in the United States simply will not believe us. In all of this psychical research, the process that goes on is still an unknown quantity. And until we know what area of the subconscious or unconscious mind is functioning to give us these results, we're just going to have to say we're getting results, but we don't know why.
Yoga is a system of physical, mental, and spiritual development. It's a system or a method of physical, mental, and spiritual development.
What can you gain through the system?
Starting from physical, you gain perfect health. You gain the possibility of not getting into disease. It is like, one protects oneself by different things, vaccinations or taking something to prevent. When you go on a long journey, they said you should take such pill not to be seasick or something. Yoga helps all this. And then also, mentally, it is that of a sudden you find out it very soon. It is not after, years and years of practice. You find out that you have a much calmer sleep and that your mind is kind of not becoming that agitated. And if something explodes behind you, you will not jump up. And it widens your horizon. In one of the yoga texts, it says that if you do the yoga postures, which is always combined with the deep breathing, these postures have an effect upon your physical body. And correspondingly, in about 3 to 6 months, a molecular change takes place also in your mental makeup. And then the horizon widens. And then you are not anymore impatient, and then you are not anymore intolerant to others, and you don't think you are the only one who is right, and so on. Everybody is entitled to their opinion and go their way, and so on. And yoga does not interfere with anyone's religious beliefs or disbeliefs. Meditation is not prayer. You just choose the object of meditation. And ideally, you become one with it. It takes time. You don't at once sit down, here you got it. There was a story, and I do not know whether it's a story as an illustration or it took place, but it doesn't matter. It's a very good story. Like a master in India had his pupils meditating, and they came out of these little cubicles, and then telling, what the result was, and one of the pupils wasn't coming out. Then finally the master called him out, and he said, I cannot come. My horns prevent me to get through the little door, because he was meditating on being a deer. And that is just to illustrate that the ideal meditation to become one with the object of your meditation. And that is why you have to be very careful as to what or whom you choose as the object of your meditation.
What is your teaching approach? Do you teach meditation, or do you teach the postures, the asanas?
Asanas I teach, but asanas, they have to know the asanas, the deep breathing, the relaxation techniques, but meditation along with it. Just to teach the asanas alone, I'm not interested, because the meditation is something that brings you, further on the path. Yoga asanas, it's alone are not enough.
You say it's a combination of the physical positions or exercises and
mental,
proper breathing and meditation that will achieve these results.
And I know so many people who kind of don't care about anything else, like say they have heard that, you can lose some weight, or you can get rid of your headaches, or things like that, and that's all they're interested. But within a few months there is such a tremendous change in their makeup that it's not the same person anymore.
Tell us something about why the asanas work. Why is this different from, or more effective than ordinary physical exercise?
Calisthenics and so on. Because every asana is performed with the deep breathing, and the breathing is a kind of opening from the microcosm into macrocosm. If you do not do any asana, supposing you would be perfect in them, and most people in the Western world, they do the asanas without the deep breathing, it will never have the same effect. Because it is through breath that you connect yourself, you make this connecting link.
Could you get the results then just by proper breathing without the asanas?
Yes, not to the same extent, because you see every asana affects one or several of our glands and organs, especially the endocrine glands. If you are just sitting and doing the breathing, for instance, your pituitary gland will not be affected, or your pineal gland will not be affected, or your thyroid gland will not be affected, or the adrenal gland. They will not be affected if you just here, you assume the position. And this position, you take in the deep breath, and you then get into this position. So, physically speaking, an extra supply of blood is rushed to that particular place which the asana is designed for. It is as simple as that.
Someone who was interested in starting yoga and hadn't really done it, how would you advise them to go about it?
Well, I will tell you, it's always better to have a teacher. But my contention is, it is better to have a good book than a bad teacher.